Magic, the one thing that sets Shadowrun apart from other cyberpunk games, and also makes it so much weirder. Or maybe not, since I doubt it wouldn't be too much different from if magic were real in our own world. This always seems to be the biggest section in any tabletop role-playing game, and Shadowrun Anniversary Edition is no exception. So without wasting too much time on an intro I'm already smooth-braining on writing, let's go into Magic in Shadowrun 20th Anniversary Edition. The Magic section of Shadowrun Anniversary Edition starts on page 177 and covers a fairly broad range of topics. To have access to magic, you need to pick one of three qualities: Magician, Adept, or Mystic Adept. Magician lets you do the more traditional sort of magic where you wave your hands and suddenly somebody is on fire. Adept, meanwhile, lets you literally surpass your physical limitations using magic. And if you're one of those sorts who wants it all or nothing at all, Mystic Adept is an option that combines both. Regardless of which you pick, there's two important attributes that are the center here: Magic, which is your raw magical power, and Essence, which is how much of your meta-humanity you still have. Your maximum magic is limited by your Essence, and things like installing cyberware can cause you to lose Essence and potentially magic, in the case that your magic is maxed out. And if your magic stat ever hits 0, you lose the ability to use magic. Permanently. Also worth noting is that every magical action somehow causes drain, which is resisted by willpower and some other attribute depending on your magical tradition. Drain is essentially damage you take because you're channeling a force far greater than yourself, much like how copper wire heats up when it's conducting electricity. And depending on how much force an effect uses, it can either be stun or physical damage. That said, let's actually go into the processes of using magic, shall we? We'll start with the skills that magicians get: sorcery and conjuring skill groups, and we'll start with sorcery. Sorcery consists of spellcasting, rituals, and counterspelling. Spellcasting is instantaneous magic effects with short preparation times, stuff that you can whip out right then and there, such as in the middle of a firefight, by literally bringing fire. Ritual casting has longer prep times, in the matters of hours, but has greater and longer lasting effects. Effects such as casting spells on somebody or something you can't see, possibly because of how far away it is. Counterspelling is my favorite though, and it's the fine art of metaphorically saying, "Nuh-uh, I interrupt your spell with my own magical power." Let's start with the spellcasting process though. Spellcasting starts with you choosing the spell that you want to cast. Spell write-ups use a lot of different terms that you should be familiar with. I won't go over every single one of them, but here's some of the ones that I think that are most important to be aware of. The category of spell, which is combat, detection, health, illusion, or manipulation. Each category has their own special considerations and rules, such as how combat spells are available in direct or indirect, or how that same sort of typing affects illusion spells. Type comes in two flavors. Physical spells, which affect the material world, typically cannot affect spirits, and in the case of combat spells, are resisted with body. And mana spells that affect the astral world cannot affect things that don't live and are typically resisted by willpower. Another important concept is drain, which is a formula for how damaging the spell is after you cast it. Generally, the bigger and more flashy a spell is, the more it will drain you. After you've determined the spell you want to use, you pick the force of the spell. And this step is very important. It determines how strong the spell is and affects the drain value of the spell. And you can cast a spell that's up to twice your magic in force. But keep in mind, casting anything higher than your magic rating in force is called overcasting, and it changes the drain damage from stun to physical, meaning you can sacrifice yourself to throw a really big fireball. After that, you choose a target that is in line of sight. You have to physically see the target. You cannot use a video camera. Mirrors and through glass are okay though. You can also cast against multiple targets by splitting up your total dice pool among everybody you're hitting. And with those details addressed, you're ready for the big moment. You form the dice pool of spellcasting and magic and roll that beautiful fistful of bones. And of course, depending on the effect of the spell, the target may be allowed to resist it with a roll of their own. Consult the spell effect or the rules category for that spell to determine what exactly happens. Most combat spells will deal damage in some way, but a manipulation spell will alter the environment depending on its effect. After resolving its effects, you resist drain. This is a roll of your willpower plus your tradition attribute, and it is not affected by wound penalties. Every hit on this roll reduces drain by 1. At the end of all that, you can decide if you want the spell to be sustained. You can only sustain spells that would reasonably have ongoing effects, like most illusion, health, or manipulation spells. Sustaining a spell gives you a -2 penalty to all other actions while you are sustaining it. And anything that can break your concentration, like getting hit, might call for a spellcasting and willpower roll to avoid losing that sustained spell. Ritual casting follows much the same process as spellcasting, but with a few caveats. The benefits of ritual casting are that you can target things you cannot physically see, and you can get helpers to improve you with the roll for it. But it comes with a somewhat lengthy list of requirements, and some of it touches on things I'll be covering later in the video, so don't worry if you're unsure what some of these terms refer to. First, all the spellcasters must be of the same tradition, and you must have a magical lodge set up that you can perform the ritual in. The lodge's force limits the force of the spell that you can cast. Additionally, the amount of casters involved is limited by the force of the lodge, as well as the lowest ritual skill among all the people that will be participating. Being able to cast rituals on a target you cannot see is a misnomer. When the ritual starts, somebody in the group has to be a spotter, meaning they go out and find the target they're casting on and gain line of sight on them. They can either do this physically or through astral projection, or you can get a spirit to do it for you, assuming that it's bound to you. When you've met the requirements, pick one character to be the leader. The ritual takes 12 minus the leader's magic hours. After that time has elapsed in-game, you roll. It's a teamwork test, so have all the helpers roll first, with their net hits adding to the leader's dice pool. Given the length of time that this takes, your target can possibly notice that there's some magical fuckery afoot. It's an sensing plus intuition with a threshold of 20 minus the spell's force extended test every hour to notice if you're the target of a ritual. After it goes off, everybody involved takes drain, even the spotter. So, needless to say, it's involved and has a lot that can go wrong. But the payoff? Oh, the payoff can be epic. Or stupid. Probably both. Last, let's go over counterspelling. This is the skill of saying no to magical effects. Counterspelling instant spells is a free action, but it must be declared in advance to protect other people. The protected character must stay in the protector's line of sight, and multiple people can be protected at once. The effect of this is that you add the protector's counterspell skill dice to the resistance roll, and counterspelling is never used up. You can use counterspelling as many times as you need to in a turn. However, it can only be used against spells that the protector is aware of. A massive fireball coming your way is much easier to counter than somebody trying to detect if you're being a lying liar who lies. The flip side, though, is that you can use your action to actively counterspell, which will work on spells that even you're not aware of. It won't necessarily grant awareness just because you messed up somebody's spell, though, much like trampling over a trap that you were too big to be contained by. Counterspell does not normally cause drain. The exception is trying to undo somebody's sustained spell. Counterspelling sustained spells requires a roll of counterspell and magic versus the force of the spell and the caster's magic. Net hits cancel out hits from the spell's original casting, weakening its effects. And if you reduce this to 0, the spell is undone. Meaning you should keep track of the hits of any spells you plan on sustaining, even if they have a simple pass or fail effect that doesn't rely on how many hits you get. After counterspelling a sustained spell, you resist drain as if you had cast the spell, meaning counterspelling spells stronger than you are can backfire, hilariously. The Conjuring skill group consists of summoning, banishing, and binding, skills needed for manifesting and sending away spirits. Summoning lets you bring a spirit into being until sunrise or sunset, whichever comes first, to perform a set number of actions. Banishing makes spirits leave sooner, most useful for getting rid of spirits summoned by enemy mages. Binding is the way you get long-term service from a spirit, as well as more options for what they can do for you. Though it's a role that requires hours, so maybe don't try it in the heat of battle. First, you choose what kind of spirit and how much force you want the spirit to have. Much like with spells, higher force, stronger spirit. Then you roll summoning and magic versus the force of the spirit. Similar to spells, your magic limits how strong of a spirit you can summon, as well as what counts as overcasting. That is, you can go up to double your magic attribute, but anything higher than that makes the drain physical. Net hits that you get on this roll is how many services the spirit owes you, while the spirit's total hits, not their net hits, will give you 2 points of drain, and you can only have one unbound spirit at a time. Also, drain from summoning will always be at least 2, even if the spirit gets 0 hits. Most tasks, or using the abilities of the spirit, count as services. And if a task takes a decent amount of time, such as pick out all the gems from this pile of rocks, that counts as one service. Contrast that with tell me if this rock is a gem is also a service, even though it's a simple question. Spirits must also stay within magic times 100 meters of the summoner. Being sent beyond this counts as a remote service. Once you send a spirit on a remote service, you forfeit any services that they owe. So, if you want to send them on more than one remote service, you need to bind them. Binding is much more difficult, but it's more or less like having a genie at your side. Until you run out of services, it behooves them to stay by you. It also requires a ritual that takes a number of hours equal to the spirit's force, and calls for materials that cost 500 new yen for each point of force that the spirit has. When the ritual is complete, the roll is binding plus magic times double the force of the spirit. So maybe don't try this with an overcast summoned spirit, unless you want your brain to ooze out of your nose when you're done. Luckily, you only need one net hit to bind the spirit. Any extra hits beyond that are additional services that they owe. Once again, double the spirit's total hits are drain, and you will always suffer a minimum of 2. The result of a successful binding, though, is that it will stay until it runs out of services, and remote services will not forfeit everything that it owes you. Additionally, there's a lot of other things you get for binding them. You can loan out their services to another character, and they can also perform services that help you with using magic, though the spirit must be of a category that matches the spell that it's working with. This is one of the places where the fluff meets mechanics for tradition. Hermetic mages have an association of fire to combat spells, and thus need a fire elemental spirit to assist them with anything involving combat spells. Even if the spell in question they're trying to work with is, I don't know, whatever the opposite of a giant fireball is. A snowstorm? We'll say a snowstorm. Somehow, you can get a fire spirit to help you with a snowstorm spell. Last but not least, banishing. This is the roll to send spirits away. It's banishing plus magic versus force if it's an unbound spirit, or force plus magic if it's a bound spirit. Net hits on this roll is services that the summoner loses, with reduction to 0 causing the spirit to leave altogether. And, as with all other conjuring rolls, double the spirit's hits, and that's how much drain you need to resist. Last, a few other things to consider with conjuring and spirits. Spirits can manifest in the physical world, but they typically do not like doing so, especially since this makes them dual-natured and thus vulnerable to physical attacks. Kind of. Most have an insanely high armor against any weapon that is not magical, so good luck using guns on them. Spirits also have physical attributes they use while in the physical world, but they use force for any astral tests. As an optional rule, having a bound spirit can impose a -2 penalty on all actions. In the sidebar on page 187, the rulebook recommends only doing this if the player is prone to abusing the spirit system, or if it's appropriate given role-playing, such as if the character tends to treat spirits as easily disposed of fireball machines. Spirits may come to dislike being thought of so one-dimensionally, and spirits are living beings after all, and I can't imagine anybody who would like to be thought of as just good for only one thing. Instead of projecting magic outward, sometimes magic will manifest itself from within. For the people who have this, these are called adepts, regardless of if they're also a mystic adept. If you have the adept quality, you gain a number of power points equal to your magic. These can be used to gain adept powers. And since mystic adepts dabble in both, they have to decide whether each point of their magic should be used for adept powers or to improve their spellcasting and conjuring abilities. For example, if you have 4 magic, you can split it so that you have 3 in magic abilities and 1 for adept powers, vice versa, or evenly with 2 in each. This means that even with Magic 6, you will never be quite as powerful as a full adept, nor quite as magical as a full mage. That said, adept powers are pretty straightforward. You pay power points, you get the effect of the power, most of which are passive. You are permitted to have partial power points, so if you have 3 power points but only find yourself wanting 2.5 points worth of powers, you can hang on to that half point until you make up your mind on what to spend it on. That said, increasing magic increases your total power points, or it can in the case of a mystic adept. Adepts can have a tradition, but it doesn't really give any mechanical benefit like it would a magician. Your magic tradition is how your character understands and contextualizes magic. How, through thought alone, they can change the world. This core book lists 2 such traditions, Hermetic and Shamanic. Mechanically, the only real difference is their drain attribute. Hermetic mages think of magic more pseudo-scientifically. It's all formulas, geometries, numbers, and patterns. Thus, they resist drain with logic and willpower. Shamans, on the other hand, believe that magic is more spiritual, more about feeling, connection to the natural world, and intent. They resist drain with charisma and willpower. Besides that, your tradition is mostly thematics. How does your character perform magic? What do their texts for studying magic look like? What artifacts decorate their magical lodge? The stuff that makes your magic more than just, I roll to cast fireball. What does it look like when they're drawing the mana in to create said fireball? A shaman might hold aloft a bundle of feathers, then look, for just a second, like a phoenix is beating its wings behind them to summon up the blaze. Meanwhile, a hermetic mage might have various geometric shapes appear around one hand, like a hologram, while they grip a polished garnet in the other. The garnet glows, the geometry spin, and a fireball comes barreling forth. With a thought, you're altering the material world. Go ahead. Be a little extra, as a treat. Spells, summoning, and adept powers are the bread and butter of the magic mechanics in Shadowrun. And I'll be real with you, the magic section of the 20th anniversary edition of Shadowrun is incredibly rich in a lot of other details. And I've already kept you here long enough. In these last few minutes, I'm just going to mention some important things you should be aware of, since they're likely to be fringe cases. There's 2 other skills that mages can have that aren't really discussed in the core rulebook. Arcana and Enchanting. Respectively, Arcana is knowing how to explain how magic works, and Enchanting is knowing how to make magic items. These are discussed more at length in the book Street Magic. Then there are magical lodges. They're a personal library of magical study. Having one is necessary for improving your magical skills, learning new spells, and casting rituals. And sometimes they can protect you from lunatics who are trying to ritual cast a fireball at you. Speaking of physical manifestations of magic, though, there are magic items in Shadowrun. A magic item is called a focus, with the plural being foci. There are many kinds of foci, And if there's a particular dice roll you would do as a mage, there's probably a focus that will help with it. On the subject of magic and items, when you're learning a new spell, you can't accept limitations on the spell. Things that you cannot do with the spell, but in exchange you have an easier time resisting drain. The core book specifically lists what's known as fetishes as a limitation. Basically an object with a minor enchantment that you must be in contact with in order to cast that spell. In return, you get +2 to any drain rolls you make with spells attuned to that fetish. And since fetishes are based on category, you'll have one fetish for each category of spell. And as for what they'd be, I once again refer you to the traditions section. Also, please keep things civil in the comments. Mages and adepts also have a method of furthering their magic power called initiation. Each level initiation raises their maximum magic by 1, gives them some cool new ability, but is something of an ordeal to undergo. It's also possible to create what is known as mana barriers, walls that can stop magic dead in its tracks. Magical lodges naturally create one of these. And mana barriers, along with anything else that's magical in nature, is visible in the astral plane, which the core book describes the astral plane as a photonegative of the physical world. It's a place where you can see the lasting marks that magic makes on the world, and possibly track somebody who's been recklessly slinging spells around. Just because the aftermath of a spell may not be visible in the physical world, does not mean that it cannot be seen in the astral world. Mages can also get a quality called a mentor spirit, which gives them various bonuses to certain situations, but it also restricts their behavior in a certain way. Mentor spirits aren't really the same sort of thing as spirits that you would summon. They're more like an ideal that your character embodies through their connection to the magical world. And not following that ideal can temporarily lead to losing your magic. Now, after that massive blitz of ideas, we're ready to wrap this up. One thing I want to touch on is a sidebar that I found on page 203 called Simplifying Drain. It basically says that to assume all spells are cast at a force equal to your magic. This way you can pre-calculate all the drain values for all the spells you know. If you must raise or lower the force of a spell, simply add or lower the drain by 1 for every 2 points of force. And mathematically, this checks out. All the spells in the core book have a drain value of force divided by 2 plus X, where X changes depending on the spell in question. Basically, the base drain of all spells is some variation of half the force that it is cast at. So, this isn't even an optional rule, it's just a different way of doing the math you would be doing anyways. Other than that, the key thing to remember about Magic and Shadowrun is that much like many other things that it offers, it requires a great deal of planning. Contrast it from combat, where it's difficult to negate an attack, it's somewhat easier to undo or prevent magic. It comes at an opportunity cost though. Time spent negating or otherwise preventing magic from affecting you is time that you are not spending on progressing the things that you need to accomplish. Thanks for watching. If you found this useful or helpful, give me a thumbs up like. And if you want to know more about Shadowrun or other really rules-dense tabletop RPGs, check out some of my other videos, or even consider subscribing. With all that said, shoot straight, conserve ammo, and never cut a deal with a dragon.